Welcome, everyone, on behalf of the Israel and Golda Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies at York University. I'm Sara Horowitz, a former director of the Center for Jewish Studies, and my research and my writing focus on contemporary Jewish writing. And so this program is very, very, very dear to my heart. Welcome to today's program, Leonard Cohen, Untold Stories. That's how the light gets in. As members of the York University community, we recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges with gratitude its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tkaronto has been taken care of by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Given that this meeting today is virtual, we might not all be gathered in the same area, and this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on. If this is the case, I ask that you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory that you are on and the current treaty holders. Today, we will be in conversation with Michael Posner, whose new book, Leonard Cohen, Untold Stories, That's How the Light Gets In, is the third and, I believe, final volume in an unusual biography of Leonard Cohen. We will also be joined by three people who knew Leonard Cohen well and whose stories about him are an important part of Michael Posner's book. They are each very accomplished in their own right, and we will learn a bit about them later on, and we'll hear from them in today's program. Joining me in conversation with Michael Posner is Lesley Simpson. I take special pleasure in welcoming her. Lesley Simpson is an award-winning Toronto writer and teacher. She earned her PhD from York University in 2020 at the Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies with a dissertation on transmission of non-material familial Jewish legacy. And I was delighted to be her PhD supervisor. Lesley's ongoing research explores Jewish ethical wills. She is collecting Jewish ethical wills from Jews around the world for an anthology she's preparing called My Grandfather's Scissors. So if you have one to share, Lesley promises to read every one that you send her. You can reach Lesley at jewishethicalwills@gmail.com. Lesley?
Thank you, Sara. It's my honor to introduce Michael Posner. Michael Posner is an award-winning writer, playwright, journalist, and the author of 9 previous books. These include the best-selling Mordechai Richler biography, The Last Honest Man, the Anne Murray biography, All of Me, as well as the first 2 books in the Leonard Cohen Untold Stories series, The Early Years, Volume 1, and From This Broken Hill, Volume 2. And of course, today we're going to talk about Volume 3. Michael was the Washington bureau chief for Maclean's magazine, later served as national foreign and assistant managing editor. He was also the managing editor of the Financial Times of Canada for 3 years. And for those of you joining us in Canada, his name may be familiar to you as a former senior writer with the Globe and Mail. So Michael, first of all, welcome and thank you for making time for us today. I'm going to start off the questions. And my first question for you is, the last book in this trilogy is dedicated to Paul Michaels. Can you tell us who he was and why you devoted this book to him? And Michael, I think you're muted.
Yes, Paul, I just want to say, first of all, thank you to Lesley for that very kind introduction, and to Sara and to the Center for Jewish Studies for facilitating and organizing this event. It's very kind of you. I'm delighted to be here. Paul Michaels was a very good friend of mine for 20 years. He was an active voice in the Canadian Jewish community, director of communications for CJA, Canada-Israel Committee, a brilliant scholar in his own right, philosophy student, deeply versed in classical music in many fields, and died tragically doing what he and I loved to do when we could in our own fashion, playing tennis one day on the tennis court a year and a bit ago. So that's why I miss him. I think about him every day.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I want to ask you about the genre in a way. Your research was similar to the way other biography writers research their subjects, particularly if they are writing a biography of someone whose lifetime was contemporaneous with their own. You read around extensively, you conducted interviews with many, many, many people whose lives intersected with your subject. But to paraphrase Primo Levi, memory is a marvelous but fallible instrument. Memory is shaped consciously or unconsciously by the person who's doing the remembering. People often remember different things, or they remember the same thing differently. Most biographers make judgment calls about whose memory is the most trustworthy, whose version of the past becomes part of the authorized memory of the biography. But you've chosen a different approach. In your writing about Leonard Cohen, you keep alive the different Leonards that emerge as people share with you what they remember. I'd like to know what made you decide to do that? What kind of remembered life emerges from that kind of approach?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and there are many answers that are possible. The first of them is that even in a conventional narrative biography, memory is no less fallible. I might interview you and 500 other people, and I would have to assess the validity of their memories. You know, how truthful to history have they been? Who am I to make that judgment? Why not let the reader have a go at that? Put them all in the book, if possible, or in an edited fashion, and let the reader decide who has the most credibility, whose point of view seems the most sound. I didn't know Leonard. I had no great desire to judge his life or evaluate him as a human being. I have no great desire to judge anybody as a human being. And this just seems to me a more democratic way to approach biography. It's not perfect, for sure. It has its flaws and its weaknesses, but it seemed to me this was a way to bring more voices to the table. And Leonard himself, I might just briefly add, was a hugely complicated guy with many dimensions to his character, and he lived a very compartmentalized life. And so we have people from the music world and the Zen world and the literature world and the romantic world and the poetry world, and you get more people joining in to provide these different points of view. As I'm sure we will later hear from some of our featured guests, when they held the memorial service for Leonard in 2016 in Los Angeles, and all these people from these various walks of life descended in the same room, many of them were surprised to meet people they didn't know Leonard had a relationship with at all. So it worked for me because I didn't want to make judgments, and I think it works for Leonard because of his complexity.
Thank you. Michael, at the beginning of the book, you include a comment from Barry Wexler, and Barry Wexler says, quote, "Early on, Leonard told me to think of yourself as a foreign correspondent filing a report, especially when writing in the first person." End of the quote. This book is not written in the first person, but I'm wondering, how might your job in creating this oral biography be compared to that of a foreign correspondent? I'm thinking about it because it seems like you had to navigate a bit of a foreign land with shifting boundaries and contradictory recollections of some of the players.
Yeah, I mean, judgments are inevitable. I mean, I would go and interview somebody and spend an hour or two or whatever it happened to be, And then you have to transcribe that and decide what's relevant to this story. And does it relate to what other people might have said? Can it be verified against what other people might have said to some extent? Can you triangulate an anecdote and make sure that it has some historic validity? I mean, there is some responsibility there as a correspondent, never mind foreign, to do justice to the material and try to verify it. But again, my goal was to try to extract the best parts of every interview from my interviewees and to try to link them together into what I hoped was a more or less cohesive narrative and a reconstruction of his life in chronological fashion. Does it always succeed? Certainly not. But I made the best effort that I could.
Thanks. That sounds like a line from, almost like a line from one of Leonard Cohen's songs. So this is the third volume in your oral biography of Leonard Cohen, and you've immersed in such detail in the ephemera of memories, just so intensively for a good number of years. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what drew you and draws you to Leonard Cohen, and what impelled you to such an intense immersion.
You know, it becomes a bit like a treasure hunt or a detective hunt in some sense. There's the journalistic quest, you know. I began with the assumption, the premise, that as good as the other biographies of Leonard have been, and there are several, and they are all quite good in their own way, as good as they were, I felt there was more to be had. There was too many dimensions to the man for those books to be totally complete. And I had dipped my toe in the waters of oral biography with Mordecai Richler. I was partial to the form, to the genre. And I thought, well, let's see what I can get. You know, I had no publisher. I just had this instinct. And I had the instinct a decade earlier when Leonard was still alive and written to him, and he had sent me a gracious no thank you note. And after he passed, I resurrected the idea. And I thought, well, let's see what I can get. And I just began with one, and one led to two more, and two more led to four more. And it was pretty clear very early on that I had stories that nobody had heard. Were they all home run stories? No, some were just bunts or singles or Texas leaguers. But in time, I began to meet people who, like Barry Wexler, like Aviva Leighton, like Diane Lawrence, who were capable of hitting home runs in terms of not just anecdotes of Leonard, but their ability to assess him, to analyze him, to provide some insight into who he was as a human being. And I thought, there's a book here. I just know there's a book here. And eventually, because I was getting mostly rejections from publishers at the time, eventually somebody's going to recognize that. And eventually, I was proven right. Eventually, somebody did recognize that.
Michael, you made a deliberate choice to write in the form of the oral biography rather than the conventional linear biography. And I'm wondering, what is your goal here for the reader? How are you trying to challenge or change the nature of reading itself? And I'm asking this question because in the introduction, you refer to what you call the tyranny of choice for the reader, and that some people may resist. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, I probably didn't do a very good job of that in the introduction. By tyranny of choice, I simply mean that in a conventional biographical narrative, as Sara suggested, the author takes a point of view. Here's my interpretation of Leonard Cohen. I've spent 5 or 6 years with him, or whatever the time frame is, and I've come to these conclusions, and here's my evidence, and I've marshaled all of these interviews on behalf of that evidence. And it's a strict point of view. Maybe I would condemn him as a predatory womanizer, or maybe I would idolize him and as a secular saint, as many have. But here I am presenting on any given page or any given chapter 3 or 4 different points of view, sometimes in direct contradiction. That's what I mean by the tyranny of choice. The reader may say, well, hey, Barry Wexler says this, but Aviva Leighton says this, and Diane Lawrence says this. Who's right here? and that can be confounding and confusing and frustrating for a reader. And I perfectly accept that, totally accept that. But I have some faith in readers that they are able to make considered judgments, and they are able to evaluate the testimony and decide whose version of truth, whose version of history is the most accurate, or more nearly more accurate, perhaps. So that's what I meant. Does that explain that?
Yeah, I think of the reader in this case like a juror. And speaking
Precisely.
of readers, you share one of your goals for readers is to help chart this course to a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the man and his work. And so I'm curious if you can cast your mind back. What was your understanding of Leonard Cohen, the man and his work, before you wrote the trilogy? And what is your understanding now after you've interviewed more than 500 people and have released the last book? How has your understanding evolved?
It's a good question. My understanding before I began, frankly, was pretty minimal. I had done oral biography, as I said, with Richler. I thought Leonard would lend himself. I knew his music a little bit, but I wasn't a huge Leonard Cohen music fan. I knew his poetry even less well, frankly. I had read The Favorite Game. I had tried to read Beautiful Losers, his difficult, experimental 1966 novel. I had tried to read it a couple times. I don't think I ever got past page 30. It just flummoxed me, frankly. So I was not a student or even a great fan of Leonard Cohen. It was principally a journalistic exercise. But having immersed myself in his life and world for 5 years, my appreciation of his work, my respect for his work, my respect for his work ethic, where I would place him in the ranks, in the pantheon of singer-songwriters of the late 20th and early 21st century, he's right at the top, right at the top. I know of, there are half a dozen other great singer-songwriters that we could all name, I'm sure, and there'd be some differences of opinion, but Leonard Cohen, pound for pound, is writing poetry that very few people are able to equal. He's writing psalms, he's writing hymns. These are religious documents in a way, and he's doing it with wonderful melodies, sometimes in collaboration with other composers, sometimes mostly on his own. And I think these songs, many of them will stand the test of time. They'll be with us forever and ever because he's speaking to a different kind of audience. He's not interested so much in the contemporary world. There are some exceptions, but largely he's not interested in the contemporary world, except vis-a-vis the landscape of male-female relationships. He's really transcendent. He's really looking at it from a very high level, and so I think he lasts. And so that's my very poor answer. That my respect for him is just enormous.
Thank you for that, Michael. Lesley and I are probably going to tease out a number of the things that you've just mentioned, but I'm going to begin with a question that is partly literary and partly biographical, and I guess you can jump in with whatever aspect speaks to you. But in Leonard Cohen's famous song "Hallelujah," the beautiful woman that the king sees bathing on the roof becomes a conduit for the poet king's hallelujah, which is a cry that blends together, at least as I read it, sexual pleasure, connection with God, and the very writing of songs or poems. The reference, of course, is to King David, the psalmist, the musician, charismatic woman magnet, as the Book of Samuel describes him. And he has sexual relations with Bathsheba, the wife of one of his soldiers, whose death he subsequently arranges. Bathsheba in the song morphs momentarily into Delilah, the seductress who brings down Samson. When I hear that song as a woman, I'm always troubled by the overlaying of the married woman sent for by the king with a honey trap sent by an enemy nation. And I'm troubled by the disappearance of the woman who's really simply there to bring forth whatever it is that hallelujah signifies here. Now, in your book, you quote my dear colleague, my late colleague, Carol Zemmel, as recollecting that Leonard Cohen did not ever seem bereft, as he was always surrounded, and this is her phrase, by a coterie, a lineup of women. I'm wondering, after having spoken to so many people about the man, how you understand the place of women in his life, in his psyche, in his art.
How much time do you have? Well, women were central to Leonard Cohen's life, any way you slice it. Although we may get into this later, just as a pure digression for a moment, I don't think anybody was more important to Leonard than his Zen master Sasaki Roshi, but maybe we'll get to that later. But so clearly, women for Leonard were to some extent sexual objects. They were romantic partners. They were, in one case, a de facto wife, and they were literary muses to him in a major way, I believe. Did he always treat them perfectly? No, he probably didn't. He was certainly had difficulties coming to terms with any form of commitment to a woman. And I think Carol Zemmel's observation and insight is probably correct. He did not tend to be bereft when the relationship ended, although there are a couple, well, there is one at least notable exception, and that is his relationship with Dominique Isserman that lasted through most of the 1980s. And we have several people testifying in volume 3 to just how depressed and beaten down Leonard Cohen was when that relationship ended. And I think he felt that loss tremendously. But listen, he was a rock star, if you want to use that term. He was touring the world. He was a handsome, charming, funny, intelligent man. Women threw themselves at him literally, as they throw themselves at many rock stars in that world. And he had a very healthy, maybe an overactive libido, which he indulged. And that was the life he led, not without cost to his family, not without cost to his soul, if you want to put it that way. But that was a choice he deliberately made, and he was unable to resist that temptation. Overwhelmingly, though, even the women who were with him and ultimately left him or were left by him and were hurt by him, overwhelmingly, they speak positively of him. Even those who were the most hurt. Carol is an exception. She never had a relationship with Leonard. They were just casual friends, of course. But those who were in a relationship with him and who were hurt by him, overwhelmingly only say positive things about him. For them, that relationship was transformative in their lives. It was powerful. It was real. It really made them feel alive. He was so present when he was with them that you only wanted more of him. And of course, he was unable to give that more because the more had to go into his creative work. So women did suffer, but I think he was as good to them in general as it was possible to be.
Michael, all writing involves selection. What chapters or categories of material did not make the final cut?
The categories of material that did not make the final cut are the rather glaring omissions of key people in his life, including, Dominique Isserman for one, Rebecca De Mornay for another. Not that I didn't try to entice or persuade or cajole or badger these people into participating. I did, believe me. But I met a stone wall. I mean, these are private memories, and they want to hang on to these private memories, or perhaps they will write their own memoirs down the road. We'll see. Those are the holes. I think the 3 books do a reasonably good job of traversing his life and the major issues in his life. Although I must say that, I late in the process, late into the production of Volume 3, I would stumble on a new voice, a new personality who I wasn't previously aware of, and had an amazing relationship with Leonard and had profound insights to deliver about Leonard. And of course, that inevitably led me to think, well, who else am I missing? And I'm sure there are many other people that I'm missing. I'm missing Morton Rosengarten, his one of his oldest friends, perhaps his oldest friend, who also decided to take a pass on participation. So there are gaps, but my books are not definitive, however many pages they amount to. There will be other biographers of Leonard Cohen, and there are other avenues to explore. I hope it makes a contribution. I think it does, but there's lots of ground still to cover.
I want to pick up on a comment you made a moment ago about how when you began, you weren't particularly a fan of Leonard Cohen. Not that you didn't like it, but you weren't a fan of it. But by the end of your project, having immersed in his music and his writing, you felt that he really is a lasting voice. And so I want to ask you this. In 2016, Bob Dylan was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. Do you think the prize committee selected the right Jewish troubadour? Do you think Leonard Cohen would have showed up to accept the award if it were his?
That's the first question is really could provoke a very lively debate, because there's lots of voices on both sides of the question. Many people think Leonard for sure deserved it. Many say for sure Bob deserved it. Bob is clearly the more commercially successful, better known. He's sold far more albums than Leonard Cohen did in his lifetime. I think it's Malcolm Merrim, who was a friend and a lover of Leonard's in the 1970s, who says in one of the books that Bob was the voice of his generation and Leonard was the voice of all time. And that speaks, I think, to the premise of your question, which is where Leonard stands in the pantheon. I do think Leonard would have shown up for sure. He would never have sent Patti Smith or anybody else. He would have been there with bells on to accept that, and he would have, as you probably know, he was awarded the Prince of Asturias Prize by the King of Spain in 2007, I think, and showed up and gave a magnificent speech that you can find on YouTube. It's really, his ability with the language is so striking and so impressive. And I'm sure he would have done the same or more with the Nobel had he been awarded it. I think the Nobel made a deliberate choice. They want to remain relevant in the modern world. They want the Literature Prize to have some resonance. And they made the more commercial choice, but I'm sure they must have considered Leonard. They had to have.
Following up on the Dylan theme, in an interview, David Remnick talked about Leonard Cohen with Bob Dylan, and Bob Dylan is quoted as saying his melodies, quote, are his great genius. Even the counterpoint lines, they give a celestial character and melodic lift to every one of his songs. That's the end of the quote. So I'm curious, Michael, what's your own assessment about this when it comes to the power of his melody versus the power of the lyrics?
I think Dylan made a really interesting comment there, because mostly people pay attention to the lyrics. And I think understandably, because they really lend themselves. There's ambiguity in them. There's depth. There's nuance. There's various kinds of interpretations that are possible. You take a song like Famous Blue Raincoat, and it lends itself to endless discussion about who he's talking about and who the three people might be and what the meaning of that song ultimately is. His lyrics are extraordinary. Interestingly enough, I mean, he did write some great melodies. Dance Me to the End of Love, Hallelujah, Anthem. There's If It Be Thy Will. There's some just striking, beautiful songs. But some of the later songs And the better melodies are done in collaboration with people like Patrick Leonard or Sharon Robinson, who wrote some great songs with him. She provided the music, or Patrick did, and to Leonard's lyrics. There's a couple songs that one of his romantic consorts on Johnny Thomas recorded on her Blue Alert album, including the song Blue Alert, and another one called Half the Perfect World. Magnificent lyrics, beautiful poetry, but beautiful melodies that Anjani herself wrote. So I think ultimately, although Dylan's point is completely valid, I still say that I would vote for the lyrics as his true gift.
So thinking about the lyrics and the music as well, a theme that keeps surfacing in this book is the spirituality of Leonard Cohen's poetry and music, both in the sense that Leonard Cohen experienced his performances as a kind of religious act, and that other people experience it as a portal or a conduit to some kind of spiritual encounter. So I'm wondering what your understanding is, having immersed in Leonard Cohen for so long, of the aspect of spirituality in his life, in his thinking, in his art.
In his life, it's central, because I think he was a seeker from the word go, virtually from the word go. He delved into the I Ching in the 1960s and 70s. He obviously was deep into Zen. He was briefly had a flirtation with Scientology. He was interested in Christianity, certainly in early Christianity, and those Christian books. And throughout his life, he studied with Chabad in the 1970s. I think Barry Wexler can testify to that. Later in life, he dipped into the Zohar. He would never have called himself a Judaic scholar. I don't think he was ever pretentious enough to do that, but he was certainly well versed, and you could say he exploited that material for his art. But that's not a crime, and God bless him. Good for him. He extracted what he needed from those great scholarly books and made it into a different kind of art. I think that spirituality is central to him. I don't know that spirituality during his performances in the 1970s or 80s was central. I think he was at that time more driven by the need to be authentic, to deliver an honest performance from the stage, to commit himself to not just to dial it in on any given night in whatever town or city he happened to be in. I think the spiritual part of him really materializes in the late Leonard, the post-2008 Leonard, those last 5 years touring the world, where he's an older man. He's confronting death. There are physical challenges that he's facing, and mortality. And I think the spirituality really comes to the fore. He begins to immerse himself. He joins a synagogue, Orha Torah, in Venice Beach, or near Venice Beach, Mar La Vista, in about 2005 or 6. And there's a rabbi there named Rabbi Mordecai Finley, who he becomes really impressed with and friendly with. He becomes a major donor to the synagogue. He goes regularly, not just to Shabbat services, but he goes to seminars, Monday night seminars that are led by Mordecai Finley. He studies with another interesting rabbi online, relevant to Kabbalah. He reads the Zohar. He reads Gershom Scholem. He's immersed in this stuff. This is very serious. This is what Leonard Cohen is about, and everything else is marshaled in the service of finding a way to put the essence of that, and his relationship with God and man's relationship with God into his music and his art. I think I hope that's provides some sort of answer.
Yeah, thank you for that, Michael. I think at this point we're going to actually widen our program a little. We're very grateful. We're very privileged to have three more guests come and speak to us. I'm going to invite Barry Wexler, Aviva Layton, and Diane Lawrence to turn on their cameras so you can see them. Barry Wexler is a producer. He is a longtime friend of Leonard Cohen. He was his friend for 50 or so years, and he himself is, among other things, a producer of an award-winning musical video, I Am Hotel. Aviva Layton is a writer and was a partner of the Canadian poet Irving Layton for 20 years, and she had been Leonard Cohen's friend for 60 years. Diane Lawrence is a Canadian-American artist, singer, and publisher. She was Leonard Cohen's lover for a brief period in 1979 and had been his friend since then. We're very, very grateful that you have joined us, and we will have a moment to talk to each of you about your own personal memories, but you've also volunteered to help us do some readings from the book, and Michael is going to talk a bit more about those readings. Michael?
Yeah, so I'm not going to hog the limelight here, but I'm just going to turn this over to Barry for the first reading. Barry was very close to Leonard and met him in the 1960s and remained very, very close to him for 20 odd years. And then there was a breach in their relationship that was occasioned by an event that Barry is going to read about and then talk about. So over to you, Barry.
So I'll begin with what Michael has written himself, and then move on to what he's asked me to read about this incident. Okay. Soon after, Cohen received a call from Suzanne Elrod. She had a startling confession to make. She had slept with Barry Wexler in New York. Sounds suspiciously like somebody I know. Barry, I'll get you for this, Michael. So, Barry Wexler. After dinner, I walked her home. She asked if I wanted to come up. One thing led to another. She said, "You sure you want to do this? You're Leonard's close friend." Unfortunately, the one question a man never asks himself when a woman offers to sleep with him is why. Their lives together had been over for more than a decade, but they were still chronically angry with each other. I was foolish not to realize that our night together was intentionally meant to add fuel to the fire. Many years later, he told me he hadn't just been upset with me, he'd also been upset with himself for allowing her to get to him, as he put it, from the dust of our relationship. Linda Clark's voice. He told me all about it. He said Suzanne did it to hurt him, deliberately, a kind of fuck you, and it did hurt him. Michael, the Suzanne incident precipitated a 15-year rift between Cohen and Wexler. My voice. For a long time, I didn't know how resentful he was. I wasn't even aware he knew about it, though Suzanne clearly wasted no time in telling him. I should have realized I was handing her an emotional grenade, but I was embarrassed and didn't have the courage or decency to fess up. There was never a confrontation, we just stopped being in touch. Now, Michael has asked me to say a couple of words about the denouement of that incident. So this was about 1990. It was a 15-year estrangement. I met Leonard originally in 1965. And that 15 years ended in 2005 when I learned about the debacle with Kelly Lynch, who we'll talk about later, I know. I called him and I asked how I could help. And we got together in a coffee shop in Larchmont Village, which is in the Hancock Park area of Los Angeles, where we both lived. And after catching up for about 4 hours, we finally got around to talking about Suzanne and pretty much cleared it. In any case, we remained close again after that for the next 10 years until he passed. And If I may, very quickly, I want to read you one short verse from a poem I gave him for his 80th birthday, which is about this. He wrote one for me, which is an Energy of Slaves, when I turned 21, and I wrote this for him at 80. It's called If I Make It to 80, and the verse is this. If I get that far, Leonard, I'll come clean about that night in New York, hoping you'll put it down to youthful indiscretion, even though I was almost 40.
Lovely.
That's it, guys.
Lovely. Okay. Lesley, Sara, we go to reading 2 now.
Yes, absolutely.
So reading, the second section of readings will include all three of our guests today. And this concerns what Barry alluded to, which is what is known, I guess, in Leonard's life as the Kelly Lynch affair. Kelly Lynch was a woman who had worked for Leonard's manager, Marty Machat, between 1984 and 1988. And when Marty passed away in 1988, and Leonard was on the eve of embarking on a European tour, he desperately needed a new manager. And Kelly, who had some familiarity, obviously, with his dossier and with his life, he decided to choose her as his personal manager. And so they entered what became a professional and, for a short time, a romantic relationship, which lasted until the fall of 2004, when Leonard discovered that through convoluted means that some $5 million of his investments, his savings, had disappeared, and Kelly was accused of having been the thief or having spent that money. And so this, needless to say, provoked a serious crisis in his life. So I think we're going to begin with Diane on this one, are we not? Diane, are you there?
Sorry, I was muted.
There you are, Diane. So I think we're going to begin with you on this reading about the Kelly Lynch affair.
Right, and I'm quoting from Betsy's Superphone. Okay. She stood by the fact that he stole from her. This was her company. No, sorry. She stood by the fact that he stole from her. This was her company. Her name was on it. She knew the truth, but she was in total denial. She wasn't going to admit it to anyone. I think she believed her own lies.
And then we go to Aviva.
And this is your comment, Michael. Among Cohen's friends and associates, reaction ran the gamut from shock to sympathy to schadenfreude. Then Eric Lerner says, the worst part was the destruction of his meticulously fortified bunker of privacy. The elegantly reclusive Leonard Cohen was up to his eyeballs in a tawdry rock and roll scandal. Then again, Michael's comment. Still, when Lerner visited in 2005, Leonard seemed remarkably resilient, saying, it's amazing, but I really don't feel too bad about all this. I'm still feeling awful about this, but not the anguish. Most things annoy me, but they don't drag me underwater. And then Eric Lerner says, by then he'd made several trips to India. I couldn't deny that some fundamental change had taken place. The old boy was genuinely in a better mood.
Barry?
And this is Perla Batla's voice. I always felt there was an abrasive energy in that relationship. I never said anything, but I'd get an earful from his sister, Esther. Leonard was very trusting, but I don't always think he had the best taste in people he chose to surround himself with.
And then I'm going to read Nancy Bacall, who sadly died just a little while ago. I think she was the closest to Leonard. I mean, that she knew him as an adolescent. So
Correct.
Nancy says, Leonard didn't trust any of his managers. This is too strong a word, but he was a bit of a wimp sometimes. It was hard for him to cut the tie. Leonard made a lot of questionable choices. They all wanted his income.
Diane, are you
All
next?
right?
Yep.
Yeah,
I believe so. So this is from Teresa Tudbury. Just one line. Leonard had this uncanny ability to pull in people who betrayed him.
Okay.
Singer.
And is that,
okay, this is, I think you've got me coming up here, Michael.
go ahead.
Barry Wexler's voice, I never understood and told Leonard this, how he could vest his affairs with Kelly. I never understood their rapport. She wasn't like anyone I'd known that he'd ever been attracted to. She was street smart, but in terms of experience, had only been Marty Machat's assistant. Marty was his longtime lawyer and manager. He prided himself on being a student of human nature, but was eventually blindsided by his own. It's almost as though unconsciously he set up a scheme with a fatal flaw. The crack may be how the light gets in, but it's also how things eventually fall apart.
Very nice.
And I'm reading Edward Singer's comment. When I heard the news, I asked Harry Rasky, his friend, did he stop her? Edward, he said, how could you possibly for even a second think? He paused a long beat, then erupted in laughter. This is Leonard we're talking about. Of course he was stooping her.
Okay, I think I read Robert Fagan.
Go ahead.
Leonard and I joked about how he had stepped into the cliche, the manager robbing the artist, preoccupied making art. He wanted to trust certain people to take care of things. The problem is, who can you trust and for how long? He probably thought Kelly was a shark who would take care of business, but not turn on him, and they had had a relationship. The dynamic of that is too hard to ascertain. I'm sure she cost the estate $1 million or more. My sense of it is Machat had robbed from him and Kelly was just taking lessons from the master.
A
Is
comment,
it? Yeah,
Gordon Cohen, who was Leonard's cousin, if you were his friend and he trusted you, he trusted you. That's what happened to Lynch. Trusting means trusting. I have investments with a Canadian bank. I still add things up every few months. Leonard never checked.
And then I think I'm reading Diane Sagatio.
I
Go ahead.
think well, it's up to you, but we skipped Asa Boxer. Whatever you want.
Go,
to.
yeah, do
Oh.
Asa Boxer, please.
Yeah, Barry, go ahead.
Leonard suffered from the Prospero syndrome, the desire to set aside fame and fortune to pursue higher immaterial objects. In the process, one neglects one's worldly responsibilities. Like Prospero, Cohen returned from the spiritual studies to find his fortune, Prospero's kingdom, claimed by another. Okay, Diane.
Okay. Diane Sagatio. I loved Kelly. We were friends. Leonard loved Kelly. I was heartbroken. We all were, and shocked. That was the heartbreak. How could somebody you loved and trusted, I mean, he gave her everything. She was family. How do you explain that?
Pico Iyer, I'm quoting from him, those people who say he was guilty of inattention. Is that right? Am I the next
No,
one?
you are, but you're Gordon Cohen, but you might have already read this. We're skipping around here. That's okay. Whatever Michael says.
Well,
Go ahead and read it.
Oh,
Go
yeah,
ahead.
I'm supposed to read the Pico
Don't-
Iyer. These people
Don't
who
worry
say
about it.
These people who say he was guilty of inattention might well be right. I said to him, this is what all those years at the monastery were about, training for losing everything. He acknowledged that and said, if it were just me, I'd let it go, but I worry for my kids and grandkids. That really weighed on him.
Okay, Michael, I'll read the next two as I was supposed to, because this is reminding me a lot of my old business rehearsals.
Go
Okay, here we go.
Are you
James-
reading DeSalvio?
I'm reading the Salvio, and then I'm reading right after Pico, I'm reading Catherine England, all right? James DeSalvio, I can't blame Leonard for not seeing that one coming, because she dazzled. She did. I liked Kelly. We'd go out for a few Hollywood nights and laughs, Some things you can go, what the fuck was he thinking? With her, you can't. And then Catherine says, he wasn't paying attention because he trusted her. He had this line, Kath, I now have to spend my days with forensic accountants and lawyers. I haven't been in a bank or a post office for 25 years. There was no anger, it was tiring. There was a pain in the ass element to it. Later, when she was harassing him, he had a kind of lightness. This is how humans behave. It doesn't mean there's nothing good about her. He'd even occasionally say nice things about her.
Lovely. Okay. So we should go directly to the third section of readings.
Wait. There's a quote that didn't get, there's another.
Go ahead, Diane. Sorry.
Don Einer. Kelly was a great ambassador for him. She worked very hard for him. She was a good spokesperson in relation to what he wanted and what his moods were. I was as shocked as anyone to hear she took advantage of that.
Very good. Okay. So having lost $5 million from his investment accounts, which he had earmarked for his estate, essentially for his two children, Leonard in 2005 is now 70 years old and largely retired. He had last been on the stage in 1993. And so along comes a British concert promoter by the name of Rob Hallett, who was not just a concert promoter, but happened to be very well versed in the work of Leonard Cohen and a huge Leonard Cohen fan, both of his music and of his poetry. And he, a very astute businessman, makes a pitch to Leonard and to his then manager, Robert Corey, and says, I can put Leonard on the road and he can make a lot of money because there is a huge appetite, a pent-up appetite for Leonard Cohen's music. And Leonard is very skeptical initially, but Hallett forces the issue and harangues Corey and others to try to get this off the ground. So I think, Diane, are you reading first on this one?
Yes, I believe I'm reading the introduction to the chapter.
Go for it.
The extraordinary third act in the life of Leonard Norman Cohen, selling out vast arenas, finding new audiences, and not incidentally earning millions of dollars, began with an otherwise obscure British concert promoter named Rob Hallett. Everyone else in the pop world had written Cohen off. He was in his early 70s, had not performed for more than a decade, and had never developed more than a cult following in North America. Hallett, however, was convinced he could mount a successful tour. It wasn't just about money. Cohen had been a factor in Hallett's life. Cohen had been a factor in Hallett's life since his teenage years. He'd read every poem and knew every album, including bootlegs and cover versions. He once attended 7 consecutive Cohen concerts. Rob Hallett. The man is an artistic god in my eyes. I was doing some of the biggest acts in the world, Prince, Michael Jackson, Backstreet Boys, Beyonce. I said, what's the point? If I can't promote my favorite artist, I've got to get Leonard out.
Viva?
This is Elliot Lefko. Hallett sat down with Robert and Leonard and told him, you could tour and make a bunch of money. You're undervalued. Leonard was saying, on the one hand, I never thought I'd tour again, but on the other, I could use the money.
Robert Fagan. Robert Fagan, Hallett. Yes, no, yes?
Yes.
Okay, Hallett. If Aviva said yes, it's yes.
Not always.
Sorry, Mike.
Not always.
Sorry, Michael. Sorry, Michael, but I take my orders from the top.
No apologies necessary.
All right. Hallett was the orchestrator of Leonard's tour and comeback. He really appreciated Leonard, could quote many of his poems from memory. He wanted the tour to meet Leonard's standards.
Rob Hallett. He said, you must be joking. What if no one wants to see me? What if I'm no good anymore? I don't know if I can do it.
Robert Corey. Leonard was very reluctant at first. Touring had always been a disaster. He'd say performing is an opportunity for 1,000 humiliations.
All right, Michael, I'm lost. What's next?
Intro and sentence and Judy Collins, Barry.
Thank you, Diane.
Welcome.
I needed that. Others, too, questioned the idea. Judy Collins, as Diane said. When Kelly Lynch happened, I said to Nancy Bacall, do you think he'll go out on the road? She said, he doesn't go out of the house. I don't know how he'll go out on the road.
All right. I think we're done there, are we?
Yep.
Okay, I'll back to you, Lesley and Sara.
Actually,
There's a whole lot of other stuff that I've got on my
there's
page.
more quotes.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry to do
Yeah,
that.
we're just
All right.
at the beginning of section 3.
And then we have to go to page 316,
All right.
according to my notes here.
Apologies.
Okay, so we skip to page 315, and I start with, meanwhile, promoter Rob Hallett, okay, meanwhile, having mounted the Anjani Thomas tour, promoter Rob Hallett redoubled his campaign to put Cohen himself back on the road. Rob Hallett. Finally, I said, here's the deal. Go into a rehearsal room and audition musicians. And if you don't feel comfortable or don't think you're any good, or you can't do it for whatever reasons, walk away. I'll pick up the tab and we'll leave as friends. At least we tried. He said, sounds fair enough.
This is Michael's. Addressing a meeting in Corey's office, Cohen said, friends, it's been 15 years. I've stopped smoking and drinking. My voice isn't what it used to be. I'm afraid I can't sing these songs. And then after Thanksgiving, Cohen, yes, that's all.
And then Barry.
To the end of the Corenza. Okay, this is Joey Corenza. Yeah. Everyone is trying to be helpful, make suggestions. We'll arrange the songs in different keys, I said. Leonard, why don't you take one for the team and start smoking and drinking again? The room went dead silent. Leonard chuckled, patted my hand and said, he'll do. I was tired on the spot.
All right, I seem to be in this a lot. Here I am again. Barry Watson. He knew he had to do it, but was nervous and wasn't sure anyone would show up after a 15-year absence. He said something about being a curiosity who might pull in a few people at most. I predicted standing room only. They'll be hanging from the rafters. He replied, that's exactly what I'll get, a suicidal audience.
And then I have to go to Dino Soldo's quote on page 318.
I think I'm just before that.
Oh, all right, go ahead.
So Joey Corenza, he never stopped working the entire time. He was constantly writing, constantly rehearsing. He'd be at the venue 30 minutes before sound check, which was often an hour. The shows were over 3 hours, and he was 72 when we started. He listened to the same blues album for 6 hours. He was like an athlete, doing things until they became muscle memory. Then you can start to make art with it.
Diane and Dino Soldo, he'd bounce ideas off you. There'd be no spirit of, what are we going to get out of this? No ulterior motive. He met you as an equal. Leonard was multifaceted, very gentle, very polished. He could listen very intently, but if he had a thought in his head, there was no getting through to him, very stubborn. He was considerate of people, but you don't get to where he got by being too considerate. Even if he didn't know where he wanted to go, he had to keep searching. If you don't know where you're going, it doesn't mean that you're not getting there.
Barry, you're going to do Lefko.
320.
Barry, where did Barry go? I think Barry is.
Do you want to read Lefko in his place?
I don't have it in front of me. Aviva, do you want to do that?
Elliot Lefko, they rehearsed for months. Leonard rehearsed so much, so he'd never had to worry about what to do or say. He never had teleprompters like everyone else. Leonard had everything memorized. And then I go to Dino Soldo. Sorry.
Next. Carenza, Joey Carenza. We were doing 6-hour rehearsals 6 days a week for 3 months. Sometimes we do the same song for 3 hours. I never saw him get upset, never saw him single anyone out, never heard him say, "You played this the wrong way." He'd say, "That was great, friend. Let's try it again, just a little softer." Or, "Let's try to do it again with a little more energy in the bridge." It was never, "You're fined $50. It was the complete antithesis of that.
Dino Soldo. One day we were doing this very slow country and western song, a downer, for 3 hours. He kept saying, "One more time, friends, one more time." It was not frustration. He didn't blow his top. It was almost there. People were falling into musical cliches.
And do you want to read Barry's part, Hallett?
Is Barry not around?
No, I think he got dropped
All
off.
right, I'll read the Hallett. I go, "Done." I walked out and go, "Where the hell are the Maritimes?" Good old Google. I booked my first tour of the Maritimes with Montreal promoter Ruben Fogel. I put key people in place: Mike Scoble, tour manager Wade Perry, accounts guy. Those were the key positions, so I'd know what was going on and what was being spent.
Okay, Robert Fagan. Hallett was putting him on tour for the prestige. He loved Leonard, but I don't think they saw this as the great moneymaker it became.
I'm just a little lost myself here.
Okay, so you're going to read Cohen continued to voice
doubt. But who said, oh yeah, this is the, what page is that?
It's 320, but we've kind of jumped a little bit back and forth here.
Yeah. Cohen continued to voice doubt. "I don't know if anyone wants to see me," he said again. "I don't know if I can sell any tickets. I need you to book me a dozen shows in the Maritimes. Let's test it, and if that works, we can go." And then Rob Hallett says that he doesn't know where the bloody hell is the Maritimes, and he Googles it.
What's your next one, Diane?
That's it. Barry's goes next, skips to Pico Iyer quote at the bottom of 321.
Okay, I'll read that. Pico Iyer, "I love being on the road," he told me. "It's domestic arrangements I find impossible." He was ready to keep on touring for the rest of his life, but being in one place with one woman was a problem he'd never be able to solve. He was perfectly frank and self-deprecating about it, but women were the least of his concerns. His kids and Sasaki were the two poles of his life. Thank you very much. Okay, back to you, Lesley and Sara.
Michael, thank you for covering for me. I'm in, as you know, in Athens, and I just lost the internet, so it took me a while.
No worries. No worries.
We're glad to have you back, Barry. I wanted to, first of all, thank Aviva, Diane, and Barry for giving us a glimpse of the book. Much appreciated, and lovely to meet you online. I have one question for each of you. You each knew Leonard Cohen privately. What was the difference between the private Leonard and the cultivated public persona? And Aviva, if I could start with you.
You know, Leonard had so many personas. I can only speak to the one. I don't know what Leonard's public persona was. I mean, I've seen many of his concerts. And to me, Leonard on the stage was exactly the same as Leonard off the stage. But I first met Leonard when I was 21. That was a long time ago. And Leonard was 20. And he came, and I was living with Irving. And Irving, and we had to keep our affair very, very private, because Irving had a job at a Jewish school, and he would have, and you know, it would have been a scandal. So he didn't introduce me to anybody except Leonard. And one day, and we were living in a little basement apartment, he said, "I'm going to get Leonard to knock on the door, and he'll come in and have afternoon tea with us." And I opened the door, and there was this young Leonard, And from then on, I mean, I had a very intimate relationship with Leonard through Irving, and there was never a question to me anyway of personas, of all these different personas. I only found that out very, very much later. He was always this magical, wonderful, warm, extraordinarily generous man. So I only knew Leonard in one aspect. And, you know, it was said before that he was very compartmentalized. And so I only knew Leonard in relation to Irving and myself. And I was very happy that when Irving and I broke up, I still had Leonard as a friend because he did not want that to happen. And I could have lost Leonard's friendship, but luckily I didn't until I saw him the last 3 weeks before he died.
Aviva, thank you. And thank you for sharing also how you met Leonard in the first place. That's really helpful for all of us here to know. Diane, could I turn to you now with the same question?
Sure. You know, when I met Leonard, he was a friend of a mutual friend, and Henry Zemmel. And I was sort of going out with Henry, and he said, would you like to go out for dinner with me and Leonard? He's bringing along this woman, and he said the woman's name. And I said, yes, of course, not because of Leonard, but because of the woman, because there was a man that I was deeply and madly in love with, who was deeply and madly in love with this woman that Leonard was bringing. And so, so I was like, yes, I want to go. So that's when I first met Leonard. And then I met him again here in LA. And it turns out we lived, you know, a couple of blocks from each other. And so I was never a big fan. I wasn't really into his music, but I liked him. And we had a very sort of good rapport, and he liked me. And then he invited me to do his album cover and design his hummingbird. But he was sort of like this friendly old Jewish guy, you know, and with a wry sense of humor. And like was mentioned earlier, he really did focus on you when I was with him. And I'd like to tell a funny little story. One of my favorites is I'm visiting him, and he famously is always asking people, do you want to eat? Can I get you something? So he said, can I get you something to eat? And I said, no, I'm not really that hungry. And so we talked a little bit more, and he goes, are you sure you're not hungry? Are you sure you don't want something to eat? And I said, no, I ate, I'm good. And talked a little bit, and then he said, you know, are you sure you're not hungry? I'd like to make you something. So I gave in. I figured he was hungry and didn't want to be rude. So I said, yeah, sure, okay, I'll have a bite. What do you got? So he says, well, let's look. And we got up. He opened up the fridge, and there was nothing in the fridge but a can of sardines. And I was like, Leonard, have sardines if you want. He says, no, they're very good. You should have. No. I've got crackers. So, you know, he was just fun to be with, and, you know, and he would take, you know, interest, and he was always helpful to the women that he knew. Like, he was very generous to so many women and supportive of what they were doing and what they wanted to do. And he was very supportive of me. I just started painting, and he asked me to design this hummingbird and do his cover. So he was a lovely, you know, generous, fun, you know, company. And, you know, I guess that's what I will say. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Diane. And Barry, welcome back from Athens. I'm not sure if you heard the question, so I'm going to repeat it for you. The question is, what was the difference between the private man that you knew, Leonard Cohen, and the public persona?
Oh, I did hear the question, Diana. It's very funny. I'll just add to that, you know, what was behind the reason that Cohen was always trying to get people to eat is that he really, beyond that, he loved doing dishes. So, you know, if he could get people to eat, you know, then he had his work cut out for him. Look, since I heard Reverend, he said, I'll tell you how I met him. I ran into him when I was 15. And in Murray Hill Park, which is a park in Westmount, his parents were, his mother lived, and he grew up on one side of the park on Belmont Avenue, and on the other side, my parents were. So I ran into him in the park. He was visiting his mother. He's about 18 years older than I was. And he was sitting on a bench. And as I approached the bench, I realized that I didn't know who he was or who this guy was, but I realized that whoever it was sitting on the same bench that I had gotten a couple of weeks earlier for the first time to second base with a girl, Vivian Posh from Westmont High. And I thought to myself, I don't know who this creep is, but he's on my bench, and I hope he doesn't know Vivian. And I was kind of upset as I was, climbing the hill there. But anyways, I got up and we started talking, and that's how we met. At that time, I wanted to be the Canadian Arthur Rimbaud, and yeah, Leonard kind of saved my life. He set me straight and said, "No, you're going to be the Canadian Johnny Carson." Now, neither of those things materialized. But as both Viva and Diane have alluded to and said, that he was enormously generous with his time. I've never ever been able to figure out why with me. I mean, it was a miracle, a gift, an extraordinary gift. Anyways, he took me under his wing and kept me there until that incident, but we got over it, and so I got back. We got back together after all those years. And the last thing I'll say, because your question did talk about or speak to the difference between the public and the private persona. In some respects, there was no difference, and in other respects, of course, there was. We all have our very personal relationships with them. But Aviva remarked on the compartmentalization thing, and he was like one of those Russian dolls, those wooden dolls where you keep taking one out. There's always one underneath, and there's another one. It doesn't matter how many dolls down you got with him. You knew there was always more you weren't going to get to, and he had the to keep the social space between you and whoever it was clean. He had a way of beginning and ending every time you were together, no matter what happened in the middle, with the same kind of, hello, friend, and see you later, friend. I once heard him say to Suzanne, who he was practically married to, see you later, friend. He had those barriers, and he kept them up. And yeah, that's it.
Can I just make a comment there on what you said, Barry? I realized later on, especially during the memorial, that my relationship, and I think every relationship with Leonard, was always on his own terms. You could see him and be as intimate with Leonard, but on his own terms.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely right, Aviva. I had the same experience with him. It was,
so did Nancy. I used to call Nancy when she was alive. We used to talk a lot about that, and it could be rather hurtful too, because you think you've got a really intimate relationship with Leonard, and you do, but then there might be a period of time when he just disappears.
I'll give you a quick example of that. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'm sure we've all experienced it among the three of us. But it could be a long night. You'd be drinking, and great plans for the next day, and let's go to Hawaii, or let's go to Mexico, let's go to wherever it is, and that happened once, and I showed up the next, in my shorts and ready to fly off to wherever it was. And he looked, because he was also what they call today, I think, bipolar, or used to be manic, whatever it is. But, I got to see that quite a bit. And, you ring the doorbell the next day and show up with your bags packed. And he would look at you with the most mournful face and say, "I'm not going anywhere, man." So it was, there was a lot of night and day with Leonard as well.
Well, the three of you, Diane Lawrence, Barry Wexler, and Aviva Leighton. You've been so generous with your memories. I could listen to these stories forever, but we only have about 15 minutes left, and I do want to make space for questions from our audience. So I want to bring to your attention, those of you who have not already done so, there's a Q&A button on your Zoom screen where you can type in your questions. I don't know that we'll have time to get to a whole slew of them, but we'll try to get to at least some of them. I'm going to open with, I think it's probably a quick one to answer. And please, you can address your questions to Michael Posner, to Diane Lawrence, to Aviva Leighton, to Barry Wexler, to all of them, to some of them. I'm going to open with a question that David Kaufman has posed for Michael, which is, Michael, do you have an interest or an intention of making your full transcripts of these interviews available through an archive so that perhaps future journalists, writers, or researchers could go through the material and make use of it as they do research on Leonard Cohen in the future?
The short answer is yes, I do have an interest in that. I have a very talented son who's a lawyer, and I delegated this responsibility to him, and he has been in touch with the Fisher Library at the University of Toronto, where a substantial portion of Leonard's archive is already deposited, and I have copied the 619 interviews that I have and onto a USB key, and they are in the process of evaluating it. It would have to be a charitable donation of some kind. I have no idea what the value attached to it is, but they have to make that determination. There will be a couple of caveats. There are a couple people who requested that this material not be made public during their lifetime. So there's a couple asterisks there, but otherwise, yes, it'll all be available to future researchers.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll pull another question from the Q&A. This one is for Michael, but I actually think that any of our guests could weigh in on their opinion. This is from a viewer named Haluk Meski. Despite the North America in Cohen's making, I subjectively felt always that he was more European than North American. Do you think there's a basis for that impression? Is he European, I guess, in flavor or in temperament or in his creative output?
Very quickly, yes, I would agree. I think he's of the world. I mean, he's in the French tradition of chansonnier and all of that. He used to make a joke about it that the reason they liked his songs in Europe was because they couldn't really understand the lyrics. But he's a global figure, virtually a global figure. I have no doubt that had he been able to tour in Africa or in the Orient, he would have been very popular there as well. He never did, but he might well have. Yes, I think he transcends North America for sure.
I think one of the important aspects of that is he was very Jewish, and that remained all the way through. Even when he became a Buddhist monk, he was as Jewish as could be. And in that aspect, that's a very Eastern European thing that he came out of, milieu. And that, I think that's the key to it.
And he was not only hugely influenced by European writers and poets, but it was also in Europe that he, in a sense, purified his style. And Viva may know the story, but he once told me that the way that happened with him was with Mariana. With Marianne, when they first met, she was still, kind of learning English. And so he's writing all these poems to her, and he'd read them to her, and she didn't understand half of it. So he'd have to go back and rewrite them more simply. And he'd go, and this process was one of, so Europe had a lot of different kinds of impact on it.
Yeah, and I wonder if he, I recall reading somewhere or him telling me that he wrote songs that his mother would like, and I think his mother was very European. Mm-hmm.
Eastern European Jewish. That's a very strong trait in him. By the way, Perry, he used to teach Marianne English, and he used to play tricks on her. And right until the day she died, she mispronounced words. Like I remember one, he just said to, I mean, Marianne wanted to know the word for nose, and he said nostril until the day, and there were about 5 or 6 words that he just tricked her into mispronouncing it.
That's so Leonard. That's really good. That's a good one.
I wish you'd
know
told me that earlier, Aviva.
Yeah. That's a good one, Aviva.
Well, I see that our hour is drawing really to a close. So very quick last question. Aviva Leighton, you alluded to this a bit earlier, but one of our viewers wants to know whether Leonard Cohen reached out to you, or you reached out to him during the last months of his life. So bearing in mind that we only have a few moments, to any of you want to share something about that with us?
Yes, and that's something that I always regret. I was just an idiot. Leonard called me about 3 weeks before he died, and he invited me to come up to his house, which was only about 15 minutes from where I live in LA. And he said, the doctor has given me 6 weeks to live. And like an idiot, I just didn't want to acknowledge that. I didn't want to believe it. And I said, oh, Leonard, of course you're going to live longer. But I should have acknowledged it, and I didn't. And then we went on to talk to a million things. And of course, he said, having told me that he has 6 weeks to live, he then said, and now what do you want to eat? Went through the whole litany of the menu, and we did eat something. We ate some corned beef or tea or whatever it was. And then I said goodbye to him. And of course, within the actual prescribed time, Leonard died. And I never acknowledged it when I was with him. And I realize now, if any friend tells me that they have just a couple of weeks to live, acknowledge it,
Sara, I just want to jump in and say that if anybody has questions that they really want to ask, I have a website under my name, michaelposner.com. They can send me the questions and I could try to answer them.
Thank you for that, Michael. So I think we're getting, sadly, close to the time where we have to close this program. I feel really privileged that you, Diane Lawrence, and you, Aviva Leighton, and you, Barry Wexler, were able to join us, were willing to join us to share some of your remembrances, some anecdotes with us. I know that each of you have a storehouse of such anecdotes, and I wish we could sit around a table drinking your drink of choice and sharing more and more stories. We have many more wonderful questions in the Q&A list that unfortunately we won't be able to get to, but certainly they're, as you say, Michael, welcome to send their questions to you and to have you.
And I would forward them to the three guests. Of course.
Wonderful. And I feel it's particularly generous of these 3 guests to join us, because this really is an hour and a half that we've spent focusing on Leonard Cohen, and each of you are really accomplished in your own right, and we could focus on things that you've done in your lifetime and your life's work as well. So it's a particularly generous gesture on the part of all 3 of you that I really appreciate. And Michael, thank you as well for joining us. And I know that we can dig even deeper to find, to read through your book and to satisfy our curiosity about Leonard Cohen's personality, his life, his thinking, his relationship with other people. And I know that probably everybody's feeling the way I do, which is I'd like to go now and listen to some Leonard Cohen music, and in a quiet room where the sound fills the room. So Lesley is holding up a picture. Lesley's actually holding up the actual volume, and Michael is standing in front of a poster of that volume. Thank all of you. My thanks to all of you for helping Leonard come alive for us, Diane.
And can I just say really quickly, if anybody's interested in looking at the artwork I'm currently doing, they can go to my website, Diane, Dianne, V Lawrence.com. Diane V Lawrence art.com.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah.
Yes, so on behalf of the Koshitsky Center again, thank all of you who are out there in webland or cyberspace for joining us. We have had a series and will continue to have a series of cultural events mounted by the Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies at York. We hope you'll join us at future events. Thank you for joining us, and Diane Lawrence, Aviva Layton, Barry Wexler, Michael Posner, Lesley Simpson. Thank you for joining me.
Thank
in
you.
this hour and a
Thank
half.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good
Patty,
afternoon.
everyone.
Thank you.